Now, tonight's event is the Lighted Window, Evening Talks Remembered, and it's perfectly timed because we're just about to enter twilight. And our speakers are Peter Davidson and Samuel Fanous. Peter is currently Senior Research Fellow in Renaissance and Baroque Studies at Campion Hall and Curator of the Hall's collections. He's also a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. He spent many years at the University of Aberdeen as Professor of Renaissance Studies, teaching literature and art history, as well as having curatorial responsibility for the university's library and museum collections. Before that, he taught at the universities Warwick and at Leiden in the Netherlands. Much of Peter's work has concerned the cultural life of recusant Catholic communities, and in particular the Jesuits, especially the monograph, The Universal Baroque, which appeared in 2007, and the edition of the complete poems in Latin and English of the Jesuit Robert Southwell. And Peter is currently working on a major project to edit all the surviving works of Robert Southwell for OUP. But apart from all that academic work, Peter has written creatively about landscape and art. His publications in that field include The Idea of North, which appeared in 2005, Distance and Memory, which appeared in 2013, and The Cultural History of Twilight, The Last of the Light, which appeared in 2015. Most recently, of course, he has produced the book to which we'll speak tonight, The Lighted Window, Evening Walks Remembered, published here at the Bodleian. And that being the case, who better to discuss the work with him than Samuel Fanous, who is the head of publishing here at the Bodleian Library. Together with a small team, Samuel publishes about 25 new titles a year, all under the Bodleian's own imprint, with the intention of bringing Oxford's rich collections to readers worldwide. And I think all of you will already be aware of what a wonderful job Samuel makes of it, because the Bodleian publications are characterized by a distinctively elegant style that we all appreciate. So without further ado, I shall now pass you over to our speakers, and I'll return again for the Q&A when they're finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that glowing introduction. And what a pleasure it is to have this chance to talk a little bit about this wonderful book, which I feel so fortunate that we've had a chance to publish, The Lighted Window. I can say I've read it more than once, and every time I found something new and interesting and striking and thought-provoking in it. So I'm very pleased to have this chance to talk with you, Peter, a little bit more about this book. And let's get started straight away. And I'd like to start from first principles. What is it about the theme of The Lighted Window? It sounds so beguiling. It sounds so immediately striking to our sensibilities. But what is it that about this theme that has proved so appealing to artists and authors over the years?
So many things that the window, depending how far away you're seeing it, is either a sign of human life in landscape or wild landscape, or else the window lighted in a city is very much a trope of 20th century writing, that all the lighted windows have different lives going on behind them in what Virginia Woolf called the fugue of the city. So you have several different possibilities at once. The possibility of an indication of a place of shelter and resort in the distance, a human presence in a larger empty or dark space. Then you have the possibility of homecoming. All very expensive house advertisements show the house at twilight with the windows on. I defy any reader of Country Life to say I'm wrong. That, particularly if you're trying to sell a not very beautiful house, it's always shown at evening with all the windows lit up. And then you have the kind of idea of all the windows of the building lit being an indication of festivity. And that's something we might touch on later, the illumination of windows in the Renaissance onwards as a sign of festivity. And finally, one has homecoming, the unknowability of the modern city. One has the question of lights in a building where there should not be lights, or where you are not expecting there to be lights, which is a very standard trope of both the thriller and of the ghost story and the tale of terror. So we're touching on all these things, and that hasn't even begun to explore the whole repertoire of romantic painting, which is something we'll possibly come to later.
No, but you have gestured towards it, because the idea of lights at twilight sounds rather romantic, and as you say, that's something we might come to later on. But in a sense, what you're saying is that the lighted window contains a world of possibilities.
Absolutely.
Where there's life, there is at some point a lighted window, whether it's a positive statement or an ambiguous one.
And what James McNeill Whistler says of his own Thames nocturnes, that at twilight with the windows coming on, there is a sense of infinite possibility, and the more humdrum aspects of the late 19th century city become invisible. But of course, we'll maybe talk in a moment about different qualities of light in the window as time goes on.
Yeah. Okay. We've touched very generally on the idea of the lighted window, and that it contains so many possibilities, and really it's a metaphor for life itself, where there's life, there is event at some point, wherever there's life behind a window, there is at some point a lighted window. But what are we looking at? What are authors and artists seeing and recounting when they look at a lighted window? Are we being presented with a scene from within, or when we're brought to the window and bade to look at it, are we bade to look in the window or at the light emanating from a window?
Oh, well, that changes as time goes on, because I think almost the first lighted window that I've found that everybody remembers is the lighted window in the forest in Comas. That the wandering children see a distant light and think of it as a taper in a cottage window. I mean, rather attuning us to the fact that the level of spillage of light from a lighted window before about 1770s would have been very modest indeed, unless you had a gentry house or a palace lit up for a festival. I mean, which you can actually see in Johann Christian Dahl's view of Dresden, that the palace windows are much, much, much brighter than all the others. Coming closer to the window, well, what this actually depends on is the raised light level within rooms, which comes with the invention of the flat wick oil lamp. One of those unsung pivotal moments in European cultural history in the third quarter of the 18th century, at which point rooms simply become much brighter. And that while you can pass along the street and catch a sort of glimpse of a candlelit room, there's a beautiful bit in John Cooper Paris's Wolf Solent, where he sees a woman reading very close to the window by candlelight and just make it all out. But later on, you're dependent on a slightly brighter level of illumination to be able to see into a window from any distance. And I suppose that at the point where so often in, say, Virginia Woolf, the vital thing is looking into a window and actually being able to see what's going on. So in Jacob's room, looking into the window of the undergraduates, and of course a woman cannot really partake of that world. And the way that she can see absolutely clearly in the light of an oil lamp, gas by then even, but can only see part of the room, this wonderful sense of observation and exclusion. And similarly, one of the absolute classic passages about lighted windows in all European literature is the narrator's walk in Proust et la Recherche, where the narrator walks through Doncières, which is fictionalized Dijon. And there's this extraordinary thought about the different levels of light in the windows he sees. Almost this kind of history of illumination that I've been talking about. So he looks in the junk shop window and it's very dimly lit. And this reminds him of the kind of light level of a Dutch painting like a Rembrandt, and that this low level is actually transformative. First of all, he's seen a tavern lit only by firelight, just as night falls. He's seen the sunset, then the tavern lit by firelight, which is kind of medieval. Then he sees a sort of Rembrandt-esque junk shop window with the junk transformed into things of beauty. Then you get to the full illumination of the 19th century, that he can see into apartments and sees that the yellow light of the lamps is like a kind of oil in which the inhabitants swim in this golden medium. It's a most beautiful passage, I think, very, very influential on Virginia Woolf, who most certainly had read it. Also, and I have a wonderful student writing a dissertation about this at the moment, hugely influential on Vladimir Nabokov, especially on that very strange novel of a European adrift in 50s America, Pale Fire, where the European fantasist, deposed king, whatever he is, keeps looking at what he can see of the poet's electrically lit window on the other side of the suburban street. There's something absolutely sort of wonderful in that transformation, that what in Proust is sort of an epiphany of the beautiful, in Nabokov becomes something terribly sinister. And of course, it's a whole novel about sinister, wild framings, and the editor trying to impose a history on the edited, and ultimately the poet ends up dead. And the narrator, editor, becomes a more and more sinister figure as the book goes on. But the whole idea of framing the window and the light there is beautifully handled, because it's kind of transformation of that European idea of framing the window and the light.
It's almost a précis, isn't it, of the history of the lighted window, that
Yes,
passage
absolutely.
from Proust.
Well, you get that in Proust, absolutely. I think from firelight, wonderful firelit lighted windows in Hardy. Actually, beautiful firelit lighted windows, both in Dresden, rather good painting in the Romantic Museum by Karus, just of a kind of ordinary house, and you can see firelight in the window. A wonderful picture in Norwich by one of the minor chaps, Stark, I think, of, again, a town window, and the light is very red. It's just the light from a fire. And then, obviously, as you know, as Proust moves on, you have candle and reflection, candle and reflector, which is the state of lighting until the 1770s. And then you have these sort of beautiful lamp-lit apartments with the golden light. I think our own light is, look at your own light, it's getting whiter and colder. It's, you know, there's going to be another change that we haven't noticed yet, that light has got, yes, less yellow with more effective light bulbs, because you're getting more light for your energy. And so my light is actually screened with a vellum shade. Your light is brighter and you have the white light at our time. You also have the most beautiful blue evening with a lit lamp beyond you, which is very to our purpose.
That's unintentional, but welcome. Thank you, Peter, for noticing that. Thank you for noticing that. It's interesting you talk about this modern light and the white light. I mean, this is industrial Bodleian library lighting here. I can't do much about it. We live in this epoch of an excess of light, as it were, and it's difficult to imagine a time before this. And I'd like to read you back your words in just a very brief few lines, if I may, where you talk about this period and you say, we have lost the feeling of being alone in open country in the dark and have forgotten how much emotion can be stirred by a single light shining in the distance. The very action of straining to see acts as a trigger of memory bring to mind journeys in the past, lit only by the stars and by the sparse constellation of cottage lights along the roads. And for me, that's one of the most evocative aspects of the book. This is something, perhaps if we live in the country, those of us who live in the countryside or who travel more in the countryside, or in countries where the population is more sparse than in other countries like the United Kingdom, where there aren't so many lights, it's just about possible to recapture something of the meaning of the lighted window to previous civilizations, previous eras.
Absolutely. I mean, that passage was actually a very oddly bibliographical one, because that's cycling from Geoffrey Keynes's house when the Great Library was still there to the station at Dullingham. And it was always rather a relief seeing the station light, because you knew you'd turned the right way at the crossroads, which didn't have a very good signpost. But yes, I lived for quite a while in Aberdeenshire, which I suppose is one of the less populated parts of Britain. I mean, I passed only 3 nucleated settlements in about 30 miles driving regularly there. And you only saw a very small number of lights from the hill above the house. And that, I think, that's the light Matthew Arnold would have known. That's the light the English Romantics would have known. I mean, Wordsworth, there's a lovely piece, it actually isn't in the book. There's a lovely piece about the lit cottage on the fell above the lake that shines like the evening star because it's mirrored in the lake in Michael. And the Samuel Palmers in the Ashmolean are all also that world of very low light and a constellation of little stars in the cottages, which I think makes Palmer's occasional supernatural lights, which do occur sometimes in those early paintings, so much the more extraordinary. There's a wonderful, very rough drawing in the V&A, which we reproduce, I think, in the book, of just brilliant light breaking through trees in an otherwise completely quotidian evening, harvest time, English southern landscape. I mean, that is one of Palmer's most extraordinary inventions. That's from this summer of the highest creativity when he was living in Kent. And that sense of light actually spilling, and almost nobody would have seen that light outside a theatre or a pleasure garden at that time, where you'd get really brilliant illumination, and the beginning of gas illumination, which of course leads us to our sort of Oxford classic moment of looking at lighted windows, which is Matthew Arnold and the Scholar Gypsy up on Cumnor Hill. That's sort of actually up towards Boar's Hill. And looking down and only seeing the lines of light in Christchurch. Now, exhaustive research and very kind colleagues at Christchurch assure me that they hadn't put gaslight in. They did a few years later, but there was no gaslight at that point. So they must have had chandeliers. And so that hall is the brightest thing you see looking sort of upwards from the south. There's a wonderful little picture in the Ashmolean by Mulcair, who's a good quotidian topographic artist, but it's a memory of Oxford. It's Oxford painted from memory, and he's given us a very precise date. And there is a slightly dreamlike quality to the picture, so I suspect it's a record of a dream. And it's looking down on the city in winter, more from the sort of Headington side. And there's a number of things in the city have shifted around in his mind and turned into a city on the continent. I mean, you've got a pair of twin towers that are kind of the Jesuit college that's in many continental cities and just isn't in Oxford. But apart from that kind of continental church that's materialized in his dream, you can't see any window light. And that's early 19th century. So none of the oil lamps. And then another picture we reproduce, there's a lovely picture by Turner of Oxford of Donati's comet, right in the middle of the 19th century, shining over Trinity and Balliol. And there you see windows have got flat wick oil lamps, and there's a kind of brilliance, yellow brilliance, coming from the windows, and then the comet in the sky above, which is just the colour of the air beyond your window, which is going very nicely to deep as cobalt now, just as it goes up Parks Road.
Peter, the era before the bright lights that we've been talking about, in that period, which perhaps it's possible just about to recapture if you are living in Aberdeenshire, if you have travelled in a country like Norway, where you see a lone light on a road, and it's a welcome sign. It's a sign of bonhomie, of civility, of an offering to the wayfarer. It's seen as something positive, and you bring that out beautifully in your book. But there's another side of your book altogether, in which the lighted window is not a representation of civility, of bonhomie, of domesticity, of courtesy. In a word, it's a light of disquiet. Why does disquiet play such a significant part in the representation, both visual and authorial, of the lighted window? And why are you so sensitive to it?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, that's a question I started to address in my book about Twilight, about the last of the light. I think the slightly long answer to your question, but I won't draw it out, is that changes are happening in your brain as night falls, and that you are switching from colour vision to black and white vision. And a great deal of what you see isn't what you think you see, because an awful lot of what you see in the last of the light is actually a compensation. And very few painters have actually painted the very last seconds of daylight. There's a wonderful Japanese print in the Ashmolean with this kind of turquoise sky, which is what your eye thinks it sees in the very last seconds of daylight. But to move on, that at that moment, you are put on a kind of alert by your brain shifting around and the way your eye works, shifting around as the light goes down. But I think that because you are rather sensitized to reading light as a presence of, as an indication of presence. If there is light where there should be no light, that is an indication of presence that should not be there. And that thus I think lights moving in an empty house are sometimes a trope of the thriller and are sometimes about smuggling or other criminal activity. But very, very often, light where no light should be is a trope of a narrative of the supernatural. Let me talk about two things. Let me talk about a house I know in Fife, which actually I talk about in the book. And let me talk a little bit about an extraordinary episode in Osbert Sitwell's memoirs. Okay, the house in Fife first, which has quite a sinister name, meaning that it's the dragon's lair or the dragon's garden. If I've got my etymology right. It's in a wood on a promontory. My godmother was brought up partly near there, and this is sort of narrative from my godmother's godmother, really. But she said the house was unlucky, that it always did things to the people who lived there. And I mean, certainly, in the 20th century, where I knew about it, nobody who lived there seemed to have lived a particularly long or happy life. But the house was then deserted. Somebody had bailed out of it rather quickly. I mean, maybe it's perfectly all right now. It's all been tidied up, and whatever it is has got bored and gone somewhere else. But At that time, the house was empty. It was also a very good terminus of the dog walk for the dog of the day. A nice walk through that kind of little-known civil pastoral Scottish landscape, barley fields by the sea, red roofs of cottages. And we used to walk up to the wood. There was a long tunnel of trees with the castle in the wood at the end of it. And, you know, castles in woods are not so common, rather French sort of thought a castle in the wood. And I used to sort of stand there with the dog. I mean, the way the day worked, I was quite often there at evening, either after dinner in summer or just sort of spring twilight. And the thought began to possess me that the last thing I wanted to see was a light kindling in the windows. Because I knew there shouldn't be, the house was deserted, the house had a bad name. And there was something a little odd about the atmosphere under the trees. And so I never saw anything. Though there was another castle which was haunted as anything, and the police kept going there to reports of burglaries and saw the lights, and there was nobody there. You know, just one of these unaccountable stories of endlessly alarms being given that there were lights in the empty castle, and then when they got there was nobody there. But this sort of led me on to the thought of not just robbers there, but sort of supernatural light. And there's a very strange episode in Osbert Sitwell's kind of roundup volume, Noble Essences. So we're just before the war, and we're in Fitzroy Street in London, and so long first floor windows. And sort of society painter, almost forgotten for a while, slightly more remembered now, Rex Whistler. I'm trying to write about it at the moment, quite difficult. Rex Whistler had gone out to post a letter, really late, I mean sort of 2 in the morning. And he hadn't either shut the shutters or drawn the curtains. He wanted to see what the rooms looked like, you know, from outside, which is quite a sort of English aesthete thing to do, to see what a room looks like from outside, imagining for a moment you're not yourself, but you're somebody looking in. And he got a huge deal more than he bargained for, which he saw because he looked in to the first floor window and saw himself at his desk, writing or drawing. And then he saw himself come to the window and look down at him, at which point, well, the man in the street and the figure in the window locked eyes, and then the figure in the window wasn't there anymore. And this is somehow a sort of portent of disaster. It's just before the war. Portent of disaster, purely private, inexplicable, vouchsafed to a sort of minor painter who, I mean, he read de la Mare like everybody else did, but he illustrated de la Mare once or twice, but not supernatural stories. But there was nothing like that in his life at all. I mean, he was quite an imaginative man, but he was rather a sort of solid individual in many ways, rugby player, boxer. And it's the one supernatural incident in the whole life. And the way that Osbert Sitwell tells it after Whistler had been killed in Normandy landings is that, you know, you can just, you have to believe that that's what he saw, or that's what he thought he saw. I mean, certainly the eye can do all sorts of things if it's under great strain. And I mean, he'd been probably drawing to a very fine scale. He did a lot of fine hatching all evening, but all the same, it's very haunting because it's slightly inexplicable. As inexplicable as something from Edinburgh, from the slightly shabby east end of the new town that I used to sometimes see. We lived briefly in Edinburgh. A window lit by candles, not for a dinner party, but always lit by candles. About the second floor of Georgian tenement, odd liminal street, mostly offices, never really found its level. I mean, built when the great impetus was rather wearing out to build the new town. And there was this second floor flat, always lit by candlelight, candlesticks on the mantelpiece, very clean windows, shutters open. You couldn't see anything else. You could then see that side of the room. But it wasn't just lit for a dinner party, which is something I used to observe because we had a great prospect from the top of a building in Edinburgh. And I used to observe occasionally candlelight and rooms lit for a dinner party and the different qualities of light in different windows. I mean, the economy of that area being quite big flats, a very French sort of model. And that one flat was always lit by candles. And there was this winter night in Oxford where for some reason we were sitting by the fire in college and I said something about it. And there was this wonderful chap from India, a philosopher, who was doing his doctorate in Oxford. And he said, oh yes, I was in Edinburgh, I saw that. My friends all noticed that. We always meant to go up and see what was there, just knock on the door with an excuse. But it had haunted him the way that it's haunted me, and so I put it in the book. And, you know, there isn't a narrative. There's just, there was a room in 4th Street always lit by candles.
These two incidents you recounted, Peter, were for me the two most the two most disquieting incidents at all, and I couldn't get them out of my mind, both incidents, for different reasons. As you say, seeing yourself is never a particularly good portent.
Not usually good, no.
And especially the way that the eyes of the vision and Rex Whistler locked eyes, that is deeply haunting, and it echoes in the imagination, and the picture of candles, but an absence, or an abject absence of life to accompany it.
Absolutely.
Seems deeply disquieting. There are so many examples in your book of this, and it makes one realize, not necessarily of the same type of story, but of disquiet represented iconographically or in the narrative, that this is a very significant part of the theme of the lighted window, and that for all its promise of order and civility, the lighted window can actually be a representation of something quite different.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose the absolute vocus classicus would be M.R. James's story, The Mezzotint, or his other version, Haunted Doll's House, that you see what you would rather not see.
Yeah, precisely. It's almost a kind of an open window, a tabula rasa on which so much can be written. I could talk about this point all night because it's so fascinating, but alas, we're very limited in time, and I've got so much I want to ask you, so many things I want to ask you, so we shouldn't dwell on this. Let me move on, and let's talk about something compelling now. We've talked about disquiet. Let's talk about the 19th century, moving forward to the time when developments and light allowed artists. I'm thinking of those lovely northern cities and the pictures of 19th century artists, Yorkshire artists, Atkinson, Grimshaw, that are so appealing. Why do his paintings have such an abiding appeal, and what is it about that time, perhaps in the trajectory of representation of the lighted window, that draws us in?
Wonderful. Well, with the Scandinavians first, it is fascinating how much longer evening twilight is, even if you get as far north as Edinburgh. I mean, twilight just lasts much longer. And the custom, just the coincidence, is people don't seem to shut the shutters or the curtains quite as early. I mean, the corollary of that is that a Scottish city at night will be absolutely lightless because of the shutters. And there's a wonderfully observed Joan Erdley in the Glasgow tenement, in which we reproduce in the book, where, I mean, the real quality at late twilight is lightlessness because of thick wooden shutters across all the tenement windows. However, that being said, continual theme of Scandinavian painters, streetlights. I suppose you're very conscious of light of all sorts in a long, dark winter. Also, the tonality of that kind of blue, late blue, where your window was about 12 minutes ago. You're quite black now. And actually, the window glass is doing something quite interesting with making the lights turning round from Parks Road, slightly greenish grey. So there must be a slight colour in the window glass. We must find out how old it is. But no, that kind of yellow and blue, particularly if snow has fallen, is very much part of pictures of the Scandinavian city. But something I've found through the last two books I've worked on is that a lot of people I speak to, not people who particularly specialise, are fascinated by the 19th century Leeds painter, John Atkinson Grimshaw, who paints slightly rearranged architectural capriccio versions of the West Ends of industrial towns. I mean, he paints other things as well, he paints docks and city centres, but by and large, his stock in trade picture is wintry. It's a street of, as it were, mill owners' villas. You sometimes got to watch him because he moves the buildings around a bit, but he's very much a worker from his sketchbooks. But it's a street, sometimes street lights, always wet cobbles, sometimes moonlight, but always rather sparse oil lamp light in these big, rather dark houses, and bare tree branches in front of the lamplight. And this is something that absolutely fascinates me because they aren't actually terribly good pictures. I mean, technically they're rather repetitive. I remember the wonderful painter Victoria Crowe saying to me that the last way you paint a winter tree is by transcribing every twig. Because if you do transcribe every twig, you've got something that doesn't look like a winter tree. Something that then caused me to look at the amazing way that she paints winter trees, which is one of her recurring things. But Grimshaw has these rather mechanically painted winter trees in front of light. But for all the fact that these are rather repetitious and of middling aesthetic quality, their poetic quality is extraordinary. And the sentiment that they seem to elicit from people is recognition. A kind of, rather like Alan Bennett's memoirs, of going for slightly lonely twilight walks on the hills above Leeds, street nights, being by yourself, wet night, sort of provincial England as it is. I mean, quite like aspects of the townscape of Lone Scotland, my own boyhood. Big villas, sparse lights. Of course, I mean, particular extraordinary thing of a street of big villas and lit windows in Glasgow is what post-impressionist or impressionist painting is going to be over the fireplace.
Interesting.
Because there are sometimes the most astonishing things over the fireplaces of Glaswegian villas, or were in the last century, probably all in the art gallery now, but they were in people's houses still. But Grimshaw, I think, finds a kind of rather melancholy poetry in the 19th century that people really respond to with a sentiment of recognition. And people find him haunting. I find him haunting. There's a lovely poem by Sean O'Brien, a poet who lives in Newcastle, just called Grimshaw, about the kind of feelings that those rather sad nocturnal Victorian paintings elicit. But I think that kind of finding a poetry in the quotidian and that kind of sense of the sadness of the 19th century is something that, though technically he's perhaps not a very great painter, he has a great poetic invention. And those inventions, I think, probably build on paintings. I don't know if you've seen. Ruskin certainly had never seen Dresden Romantic paintings, because, not to be boring, but in Ruskin's academies, he keeps saying, this is the first time it's ever been done, and isn't Millet wonderful? He does something that, the entire Dresden school have been doing since 1805. So, I mean, obviously, there's not a high awareness of the sort of Dresden dusk and night paintings. But be that as it may, Grimshaw does something poetic with the fairly ordinary, in the way actually that Dresden painters do in wonderful paintings of the suburbs of Dresden that I mean, by Karus particularly. Paintings of his own house rendered romantic by nightfall.
Well, that leads me on very nicely to my last question, because I'm afraid we're running out of time. In the penultimate chapter, you do talk about the northern cities and the elongated twilight and the sense of romanticism that engenders in artists and in literature. And there are some beautiful examples that you reproduce in the book. And then you go on in the last chapter of the book to talk about quite a specific phenomenon that took place in, I believe, in Dresden in the 18th century. And I wonder, in the last few minutes, whether you can tell us a little bit about that and the specific this specific idea of the lighted window.
But of course, Dresden at the turn of the 19th century, despite all the sort of political reverses and the wars that come from the Napoleonic movements in Europe, Dresden is really an extraordinary place of focus, of activity in all the arts. And you have a kind of critical mass of painters. I mean, most remembered painter being Caspar David Friedrich, Carl Gustav Carus, pupil and friend of Friedrich's, court physician, wonderfully interesting man. Then there's all sorts of other things going on. There's a kind of terribly high-level amateur theatre where they do experiments with scenography, and I'd love to know more about that, and I hope to study that more one day. They're very conscious of the arrangement of environments. They're very conscious of things political. They're very conscious of the beauty of the city itself, because you have a kind of very concise, very beautiful Baroque city centre. And then you have this wonderful 19th century outer city. Anyhow, I mean, much destroyed, much reconstructed. But what really fascinated me, and I have found very little on this in English, just one book published out of the Huntington, is the phenomenon of pictures that are, in a sense, windows. Because one thinks of a picture usually as something you look at with the light in front of it, though it may have depictions of light within it, and very interesting indeed that the technology for doing something with a picture to produce light behind it seems to be a kind of byproduct of the Baroque theatre. That there certainly are designs by Andrea Pozzo in Rome for sort of temporary church installations with pictures lit from behind, painted on silk or painted on varnished paper. But what they discovered in Dresden is that, of course, you can render paper translucent by adding varnish to the back of the area that you want to want to be transparent. And so what they were actually doing was making translucent pictures, and then there were sort of evening performances. I think we should think of these as very continuous with the kind of domestic, quasi-dramatic way in which, say, Schubert's Die Schöne Müllerin was first performed. And so what they did was there were these sort of theatres with transparencies and lights moving behind them and music, and sometimes coloured light. And that there is one wonderful Friedrich in the art gallery in Kassel that is actually a transparency that you can turn round. So you get 4 pictures for your one sheet of paper. And that if you do it as an evening transparency lit from the back, it's actually a city appears quite sort of magically. And as a thrilling note on which to end, these were everywhere. There's a wonderful book in Bodleian, about 1805, saying, about homecraft, how you can do varnish prints and pictures for home use, for fire screens, for pseudo stained glass windows, for overdoors. And that these things, obviously kind of ephemeral.
Which is why they don't survive.
Yep. And I do wonder sometimes if some of the English Romantic paintings that have varnished in the medium, I mean, some of those odd pictures by Blake and his followers, again, some early palmers, may in fact be transparencies, meant to be seen with a candle behind them. And I'm delighted to say that I managed to buy one at Ballon's yesterday morning.
Congratulations.
Very unusually, published by Ackerman in 1799 in London. Varnished picture of Gothic ruins with a procession, designed for backlighting, framed with glass on both sides of the print. Have not yet taken delivery, but you know, I think it's somehow part of this whole conversation that the first time I've ever seen a transparency offered for sale was yesterday, and I bought it.
Well, good for you. Good for you. So now you have your own, as it were, internal lighted window.
Precisely. And I have a little representative of that whole German Romantic, English Romantic, and we would understand Regency popular art tradition.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, on that note, I'm very sorry to say, I think we've run out of time for the conversational aspect of our discussion this evening, but we are, of course, taking questions. And I think there may be some, I wonder if there are any questions already.
Yes, I thank you for that wonderful exchange, because I think it brought out the sort of complex associations of the lighted window that we all experience viscerally, I think, but find it very hard to articulate. It's difficult to put these things into words. So I would ask people, I'm sure there must be many questions. I'd ask people to put the questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, and I shall try to deal with them now. Yes, I mean, we have a question that says, just thinking about Whistler and the harbinger of war, did you come across anything in your research that explored the effect of the wartime blackout culturally in literature or art?
Yes, indeed. And I've put a little into the book itself, that there's a wonderful letter of Sylvia Townsend Warner's about visiting London in the blackout, and that she says that the blackout has rendered London like the country, that there are the kind of sparse, as it were, lanterns at the entrances to the underground stations and the shelters, and no other visible lights. And she says that it has rendered London, well, like the country, but also touching, in that there are such small human lights in the very, very dark spaces of the city. I suppose the other really great, well, to my mind, piece of writing about the blackout is Edmund Crispin's The Case of the Gilded Fly, where the whole, I'm not going to do a spoiler, it's too good for me to do a spoiler. It's really one of the best things written about Oxford as a place as well. But the whole way that blackout and windows that are not lit is vital to the story. I shall say no more than that. But that there is this absolutely brilliant moment where he's misdirecting you like fury through the whole vital chapter. I mean, he's telling this, one of his characters is telling this absolutely nonsensical endless ghost story that has the brilliant effect of not only misdirecting you from the murder, but it actually misdirects you from the subsequent murder. Which is, I mean, economy is brilliant narrative. But what he does is he conjectures a free French pilot flying over Oxford in the microsecond where someone is fumbling with the blind and seeing the shaft of light striking up out of the otherwise completely darkened country. And the free French pilot, who never appears again, says, "Ce blackout en." And that is the end of the tissue of misdirection. I think that is it's the most wonderful piece of writing. It is also the most wonderful use of the blackout as a fictional device. Lovely question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Ian and Helen Wells, and they say they read today in an article on the ultra-modern house that windows are not to look at from the outside, but to look out from the inside. And have you touched upon that in your in your book?
Oh, no, I haven't, because my wife wrote about it so brilliantly in her Baroque Between the Wars. I'm very unsure about some of the particularly Corbusier assertions about, oh, they're so you can look out and it's all very innocent. That I think with that kind of rather authoritarian modernism, there is an element of surveillance. There's a really wonderful thing that Jane, my wife, brought forward in her book, Baroque Between the Wars, that Corbusier never built for women. And that the kind of houses he built were not suitable for lives lived by women. They were very masculine houses. And that the one time that a woman in his circle had the temerity to build herself a house, Eileen Gray, it was infinitely more private than a Corbusier house. And he went in and kind of vandalized it, saying that he had kindly painted murals, but actually he vandalized it. I think there's something very interesting about also the kind of American contemporary photography that looks across the street to the picture windows of the apartments and looks in a way that's actually slightly troubling. Though, of course, those windows must be beautiful things to look out of during the day. Interestingly, actually, there's a whole set of Dresden paintings about looking out as well. But I think in strictly modernist terms, I see the idea of kind of embracing 360 degrees of the landscape, but actually very often the way that some of the maybe more overexposed modern theorists of architecture write, it's a kind of element of surveillance as well. So it's a very rich question, and I think the answer is slightly ambiguous.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another interesting question from Nancy Mackey, who says, in our age where electric light is virtually ever present, do you think the significance of light has lessened so that we don't now notice the sort of moments you have described so vividly?
That's a wonderful question. Actually, it's one I slightly addressed in the Last of the Light book, that the level of electric light we're now exposed to is doing something to our brains. And that I can't quote an absolute scientific number, but a friend of mine, writer friend of mine in Cambridge, says something like 55% of British children have no black and white vision because they've simply never been in low light. I mean, I have very good low light vision, but that's living in the country. But I think that also this is something how you relate to rhythms of light and day and season, that nobody Scandinavian will live the whole day through in the brightest level of electric light, that there's always some element of watching the daylight go, so at least your body clock is aware of what's going on. And that I was on the periphery when I was in Aberdeen of a very interesting, sadly it never really took root, but it's a multidisciplinary study of living, how you lived in the north. And something about going from a strip lit office to a strip lit gymnasium to a television screen actually did horrible things to your brain because you had no chance to orient yourself to the progress of the day. And we still need to orient ourselves to the progress of the day, to live kind of sensibly. I mean, there is less, perhaps, seasonal affective disorder the further north you go in an odd way. That people have got very skilled at living with the winter. I mean, I think that's something that we felt in Aberdeen because we were actually on Scandinavian latitude, but within a British culture, that we didn't particularly have we were looking for ways. That's how I got pulled in to talk about cultural history, about ways of living with the winter. So I think that there is all of this, and just as an epilogue, it's such a lovely question, that Gregory Crewdson, who's very sinister, American photographer. I mean, deliberately sinister. He's someone who stages photographs, their works of art. He does a lot with the nastiness of electric light and sort of terrible edges of small towns with an overlit supermarket and kinds of superfluities of light and the kind of street light that is perhaps surveillance rather than guidance. Something actually very notable about Edinburgh is that they've got a particularly muted, in the old city, they've got these very muted street lights, which were a conservation decision actually of quite some time ago, and that they still light. This is the complete difference. They still light at head height, well, just above head height. So these lamp standards are part of the railings, and they're white light, gas light, facsimile, just above, not far above head height, so that the way you see the facade of an Edinburgh, well, not 18th century, early 19th century house, actually the rustication all works because it's lit from the right height. And if you lit those from arc lights at roof level, you'd lose the whole thing. And I mean, I think actually the way that cities are lit is a kind of fascinating question. But I mean, that's a lovely question. I could go on with it for so much longer.
We're running out of time, so we have one or two more questions, but there's one fascinating one here that asks you, would you say that TVs and mobile phones now offer a new form of lighted window into other worlds?
I can answer honestly by saying I have not. So I don't know. I mean,
what a horrible thought.
I have been very sad looking down from the top floor of the Museo di Roma and seeing, I counted 70 people walking through the Piazza Navona without ever raising their heads from the screen in their hand.
Yes. Yeah.
Which somehow seemed to be hideously emblematic of something.
Yes, the gondoliers in Venice are doing the same thing. Last time I was there.
I mean, something that really does, I mean, it's a wonderful question. It's a very thoughtful question. Yes, in a sense. And my goodness, where would we all have been without screens in the last few years? And there's wonderful things that can happen with screens, but I don't know. I've never had a television. I just can't. I don't believe in television. I can't make myself suspend disbelief and think this is a cinema. And I always feel just terribly uncomfortable in a room with one. And I mean, I sort of watch cricket on television and found it very odd.
Okay, I think it's very good. That's a very good answer. I mean, one last question. It's rather too big, I think, but just about the impact of different cultures, Catholic, non-Catholic environments, northern and southern, and so on, in terms of the use of windows. Would you see that as a major factor?
That's absolutely lovely question. That's brilliant. Well, I am myself both northern and southern, being half Scots and half Spanish. You live so much more of your life in the street in the south. The kind of relation of inside and outside is beautifully subtly different in the south. And my eternal recreation in southern cities is twilight walks bagging painted ceilings, which is, there's a very good painted ceiling at 99 Great Russell Street, if anyone's ever passing at twilight. Very good painted ceiling. I mean, good early 18th century Bacchus and Ariadne. But a real pleasure of walking in Rome is somehow the lighting window is less domestic than you see what's on the ceilings. And that's marvelous. But I think in southern countries, you're so much more using the street as for social space. And I mean, if you're actually for most of the year, you don't really sit inside, you sit on a terrace. Now there's a whole different world of the lit booths at the Feria de Sevilla or something, that you have this sort of completely different, outside lit cafe terraces And then there's sort of little entertaining spaces you get sometimes at festivals. And you get those in Salamanca in September as well. I mean, that's sort of a lovely, different sort of lighted window.
Thank you very much. The last question I can answer myself, because people are asking how they can buy your book. And there is a link in the Zoom chat, which will allow anyone who wishes to do it to do that now. So I think we must now wrap up, but I just wanted to thank both of our speakers, particularly Peter and Samuel, for giving us a really wonderful insight into the whole notion of the lighted window. And all the time you were talking, I kept thinking of that wonderful, surrealist painting by Magritte, Empire of Light, where you have the house in complete darkness with those sinister lights in the window and the lamp outside and a brilliant daylight sky, blue sky overhead, making us think about the associations we make. But I think those disquieting elements you brought out terribly well. So thank you both for doing that for us.
Great pleasure. Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Peter.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.